Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa mawalah. My dear respected brothers and sisters in Islam, students of Al-Islam Academy, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I welcome you again into the fourth lecture of Hadith. Now, before we start, I just would like to clarify a point from the last lecture. I didn't think it was clear enough. It's about the mutawatir hadith, the hadith that comes to us through many routes. And I mentioned and said that being mutawatir or not, and the number needed for that condition, depends on the situation. Now, I think that part is a bit vague, so I would like to clarify that a bit more before we start today's lecture. So, the number, depending on the situation, what's the deciding factor? The deciding factor is our logic, our intellect, when we analyze this situation and decide, is this enough for this to be mutawatir or not? That's why, as I said, the number is not that important. Let me give you an example that will make things a bit more clear. Let's say there's a party. 50 people attended that party. The next day they're telling us about a situation or an event that happened during that party. Will we take this as mutawatir? No. Why is that? Now, those 50 people, is there a chance that they got together in the party and decided they're going to say something and try to spread that thing that they wanted to say and pass it on to others? There is a chance that that would happen. The other thing is, most of them will likely be intoxicated. Some of them will be on drugs. So any reasonable person will never think of this as mutawatir. Now compare this to 50 of Sahaba narrating a situation or a hadith about the Prophet ﷺ. And then they pass it on, and then it gets narrated by 200 of the tabi'een and even more of the tabi'een. Is this mutawatir? Yes, it is mutawatir. This is what we would consider mutawatir. And this will be explained more in regard to comparing the Sahaba to the people in the party, because there are conditions for us to consider hadith or narration to be authentic. Another thing to consider is that the Prophet ﷺ, and throughout his life, he went through many events and many situations. Some of them, he had tens of thousands of Muslims with him. Example is the Battle of Hunayn, 12,000. The Hajj of Wada, there were 100,000 Muslims with him in his only Hajj that he made. So anything that comes out from that, you can imagine how many people will be narrating from those events. Compared to, there were situations where he was talking privately to one of the Sahaba, or they were in a very small gathering of 4 or 5 people. So that means the narration will be obviously very limited in those situations. And then that will be ahad, and then the other one will fall into the mutawatir, especially if many people of the people who attended the event narrated the hadith after that. So hopefully this makes things a bit more clear, and inshallah as we go, things will get easier more and more, bi'idhnillah. So we mentioned in the last lecture that hadith is divided into mutawatir and ahad, many roots, much less roots. The mutawatir is subdivided into lafzi, something that comes with the exact wording, and then ma'nawi, something that's basically transmitted or narrated with the meaning. Whereas ahad is subdivided into gharib, stranger, that comes through one narration. And then there's aziz, which comes through 2 or 3 narrations. Now, aziz has 2 meanings in this context. Either you say aziz from being strong, so it's got a bit strong with the addition of the 1 or 2 narrations compared to the gharib. Or you can say it's the rare, because still, it's not gharib, but it's not mashhur, the famous one, that's narrated by more than 3 people, or come through more than 3 routes, and that's what we call, as I said, the mashhur or the famous one. So those are the three types of the Hadith al-Ahad. We also mentioned in the last lecture that the Hadith science does not deal with mutawatir of Hadith, because that's confirmed, that's authentic. The science of Hadith and the rules of this science is applied to the Ahad Hadith to verify it, to double check, to be able to say this is an authentic Hadith or not. Now for the Hadith of Ahad, our verdict, our ruling after applying the science of Hadith divides it also into two types: accepted and not accepted, maqbool and mardud. Now what's the maqbool, accepted one? Accepted also falls into four categories. One is the Saheeh, Saheeh lidhatihi, authentic on its own without any support. And there is Saheeh lighayrihi, authentic but only with some support. And there's Hasan, which means good or nice. It's less degree than the Sahih. So, and there is Hasan lidhatihi, it's good on its own, and there is Hasan lighayrihi, it's good with support. Now, it might be confusing now, but shortly and as we continue, as I said, things will be much clearer. So we have those four types are of the maqbool, accepted hadith. For the mardud and not accepted hadith, that's all falls into the category of da'if, weak hadith. And it also has many types: fabricated, very weak, broken, and we'll get to this later on inshallah during the course. Okay, so now we come to the conditions of Sahih Hadith. What are the conditions that the scholars put to call this hadith sahih or authentic? There are 5 conditions. The first one is the narration should be continuous. The second one is the narrators should be all trustworthy. The third one is those trustworthy narrators should have the ability to give precise and very, very informative narration. And that could come from two routes, either with having very strong retentive memory or have very good written documentation, or both. The fourth condition is that there shouldn't be any deviation or what they call shudud in that hadith. The fifth one is that there shouldn't be any concealed or hidden weakness in that hadith. Inshallah, now we'll go in details for each one of those conditions. So for the continuous narration, how do we know that this narration is continuous or not? So we have the chain of narrators. We need to make sure that each of those narrators has actually heard what he is narrating or got it directly from his teacher, from his sheikh. Now how do we know that? This is done by studying the biography of all the narrators and know when they were born, where they lived, who were their teachers, where did they travel. Now it's not only that, we need to pay attention to the mode of transmission between the sheikh and the student. And that's, you see that through the terms that they used when they describe in the chain of narration, when they describe how they got the narration from the sheikh. And now we'll list those modes of transmission among the narrators of hadith. The first one and the best one is direct hearing from the sheikh. So the sheikh will be sitting in his class and he's narrating himself his hadith to the students. And then the students in this occasion, usually they narrate this as sami'na, I heard, or he told us. The other one, which is the second one, is when the sheikh hands down or hands over his book to one of the students sitting in the class, and then that student starts narrating the hadith. He starts basically reading the hadith, and the sheikh is listening, and he approves what the student is saying. And this is the second form, which is also a strong form. And in that they say akhbarana usually, which means informed us. They don't say he said or told us, because he didn't actually tell. He informed in that situation. Those are the highest two types of transmission. Then we have the third one, which they call mukataba, writing down to a person through a middleman. This is called mukataba. So someone writes hadith or something and sends it as a letter through a person that transfers that letter to the other person. And in that case, he needs to say, he wrote to me and said that. The fourth one is something called wajade. Wajade means someone finds a document, like let's say his father died who was a hadith person, and then he finds a notebook or a book with his father's handwriting. That's called wajade. And then when he will narrate, he'll say, I found this document with my father's handwriting that's got those hadiths. Then there's another one and another mode which is called authorization, license. Here the teacher, the sheikh, has got a book or a notebook. He hands it down himself to the student and say, I authorize you to narrate this. Now, this is better than mukataba, the one that we mentioned before. Why? Because there's no middleman. It's the sheikh himself handing over the document to the student. And because if there's a middleman, that means something could have changed. You need to trust that middleman that transferred and took the letter to the other person. So there is potentially some weakness there. Whereas when you hand over the sheikh hands over the document to the student, that's much stronger and much more authentic. Now here you see why narrating the hadith verbally is much better than the written one. Because when you narrate something verbally, the error margin is much less than you hand over a written document. Because remember, they were all handwriting. Now, if you are someone like me who writes something today and comes the next day, I can't even read my own handwriting. So there's potentially big problems that can happen. They can change the narrator name, especially in Arabic there are dots, and the dots can change names and make it a different narrator. Now that can mean that from being a authentic, thiqa, trustworthy narrator to a weak narrator. This can change the whole verdict on the hadith. So that's why they put the verbal transmission at the highest level, and as we go down, it gets less and less powerful. Now, just a quick point I would like to make, that in the quizzes, when we mention the Arabic form, we will have the English meaning in between brackets, basically, so to make this easier for everyone. Now we come to the second condition of the Sahih Hadith, which is the trustworthy narrators. All the narrators in the chain of narration, they need to be trustworthy. Adl, that's the Arabic term for it. Now remember when I told you that the scholars of Hadith, they were inspired by Quran when they came up with the rules of the Hadith science. Now in Quran, Allah tells us, يا أيها الذين آمنوا إن جاءكم فاسق بنبأ فتبينوا. O who you believe, if a non-pious person comes to you with information, then verify it, double check. Now the opposite is true as well. That means if a trustworthy person comes to you with information, then accept from them. And this is what we are doing in the Hadith science. Now what are the conditions of adl, trustworthy? They need to be Muslim, obviously. They need to be sane. They need to be post-puberty. They need to be pious. That means that they avoid all the major sins and most of the minor sins. They are no angels, but as I said, avoid all major sins. You do not expect someone who's narrating the hadith of the Prophet to be committing zina, drinking alcohol, any of those things. Obviously, they need to be worshipping. They need to do all the obligatory acts and lots of sunnah. And also, they need to avoid mostly the minor sins, only in very few occasions. There's also another condition, which is they avoid all acts that are looked down upon by the Muslim community or Muslim society. For example, someone, now those actions does not need to be haram in itself, but as I said, if it's looked down, it's considered not acceptable in a Muslim community, then that person should be someone who avoids those things. Now, just in regard to the post-puberty or the Muslim condition here, now the person could take the riwayah or witness the event when he was kafir or when he was a child, but the narration should happen when they are adult and when they are Muslims. Now, some say it's really difficult, or we can never be sure of the adil, the trustworthy character of the person. And for that, we will answer that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, in Surah Al-Talaq, for example, He said, وَأَشْهِدُوا ذَوَيْ عَدْلٍ مِّنْكُمْ, and use witnesses from among you, from those who are pious and who are adil. So Allah confirms that this character can be confirmed by us. Now I'll give you a practical example. If a father, someone proposed to marry his daughter, what does he do next? He goes and starts collecting information about that person. He goes to his workplace, goes to the mosque, goes to the neighborhood, starts collecting information about that person to be sure or to have a good idea if that person is trustworthy or not. So that means this thing can be done in real life. Now, if he fails to do so, then the problem is that he didn't actually work hard, or he didn't look everywhere for information. So the problem is with the person that was collecting the information, and not with the fact that trustworthiness can be confirmed if you do detailed research about the person. And where do we get those information? We got this information, as I said, about the biographies as well of the muhaddithin, of the narrators, through the ilm, the science of the jarh wa ta'dil, which they also call it the science of men. Now, why do they call it the science of men? Obviously there were some narrators who were women, like, as we said, Aisha radiallahu anha, her student Amra bint Abd Rahman, and there were many sahabis and tabi'in who were narrators, women. But as things progressed, you see that 99.9% of the narrators are men, because those narrators, those scholars of hadith, they needed to travel. They needed to go to different cities collecting hadith, listening to mashayikh in those cities. In those cities, obviously traveling, there's no plane or something. They take sometimes days and months on camels, sometimes even walking. They stay in hotels, they sleep in mosques, and most of them were actually poor because they weren't working. So this gives you an idea how it was almost impossible for a woman to do this trip, to go through this journey. And that's why most of the narrators were men. However, some were women that did not need to travel. As I said, the initial narration came from the mothers of mu'mineen or the sahabiyat that were with the Prophet ﷺ in the Medina. So that's why it's called the science of men. Now, who were the main scientists or the scholars who looked into that? One of the main ones was Yahya bin Ma'in, and most of the other scholars of hadith, they also wrote books or wrote papers into this science. Now, as I said before, I think we have one of the books called Tahdhib al-Kamal that comes in 38 volumes. And that's only for the 6 books of hadith, the narrators of the 6 books of hadith. Imam Bukhari, when he made the big history at Tarikh al-Kabir, that was 14,000 narrators. We have Tarikh Medina Dimashq also, that's another book. We have Siyar A'lam al-Nubala, 17 volumes. So, and many more. So this is how the scholars will go through every narrator, his life, his biography basically, and come up with a verdict about that narrator. Is he trustworthy or not? And this leads me to the next condition, which is the accurate narration. That person to be of precise and accurate narration from his sheikh. And as I said, this could be in the form of strong retentive memory or very accurate handwritten documents that he uses when he narrates the hadith to his students, sometimes both. Now, where do we find the information about the accuracy, and how do we ascertain the accuracy of the narrator when he narrates the hadith? Obviously, this will be in the books, as we said, the books of Jarh wa Ta'dil, the books of the main science. All those verdicts will be there. And how did the scholars get those information? There were three main things that they used to do. The first one was what the teachers or sheikhs of that narrator said about him. So those scholars will go and collect those information from the mashayikh. The second one was direct testing of the narrator. How do they do that? So they go to the sheikh, and then they'll start asking him about hadiths, and they will replace the matin and sanad of some hadiths. He may have narrated them or not, and give him some of his hadith in the correct way, and in the middle they will put some of those fabricated, or they're not fabricated, they actually made up hadiths by replacing. The sanad is true, the matin is true, but they're all replaced or sometimes even messed up. But they try just to replace them to make it more difficult, because then you know that there is such matin and there is such sanad, but does it belong to the same hadith? Okay, so what they do is they do that and they put them in the middle of the hadith. Now, if the sheikh does not pick that up, then they'll say his hifz, his memory, his accuracy is not good. So that was the second way. Now, I'll give you an example of the testing of Imam Bukhari. Now, this is a story that was narrated in the books of hadith, mainly a scholar called Ibn Adi. He narrated that, and then Khatib al-Baghdadi and other scholars, they narrated this story about the testing of Imam Bukhari, so that you see how they tested him. But the most important thing is to see who Imam Bukhari was. So as I said before, I told you that Imam Bukhari, after he finished his book, the Saheeh al-Bukhari, he will go to different cities and stay there and start narrating his book, the Saheeh, to people, to students. Now, when he went to the city of Baghdad, the scholars there prepared a test for him. What did they do? They took 10 students of knowledge. They gave each one of them 10 hadith. And they messed up the sanad and the matin. They replaced them all. So each student had 10 hadiths. By 10 students, there's 100 hadiths. So Bukhari came, they said people were everywhere. The mosque was just full of people. Everyone wants to see this Bukhari. So then when the Imam sat in the masjid and was going to start his lesson, then the students started getting up one by one, asking him about the hadith. So the first one will get up and say, what do you say of this hadith? And he gives him the hadith, which obviously got the matin and sanad, they do not match. They come from different hadiths. So he says, I don't know this hadith. The second hadith from the same person, I don't know this hadith. Third, I don't know this hadith. And he did that for every single hadith up to the 10th student. So 100 hadiths, all what he says is that I don't know this hadith. And he's honest. He doesn't know this hadith because there's no such hadith. That matin does not belong to that sanad. So then the scholars that were there who prepared the test, they said, the man knows what he's talking about. And the people, the lay people, al-awam, they said, oh, is this Bukhari? We heard, many things about him. This is Bukhari. So then when those students finished, Bukhari said to the first one, okay, your first hadith, you said this, and the correct one is this. Your second hadith, you said this, and the correct hadith is this. The third one, you said this, and the correct is this. And he went for the 100 hadiths with the 10. Each one of them, he said, you said this in your first hadith, and this is the correct one. So people, the scholars mention that we're not amazed that Bukhari actually memorizes the correct hadith, because that's Bukhari. But for him to be able to memorize the wrong hadith from the first time, this was the most amazing thing. And that's why we say Bukhari, because this is Imam al-Bukhari. And if you look at his life story, Imam al-Bukhari he hears the thing once, copy, paste in his brain, doesn't go away. And we may, inshallah, take some part of his story when we talk about his book, inshallah, Saheeh, and his methodology in his book, inshallah. Now, the third way of confirming the accuracy of the narrator, which is the most common one, which is the most important one, because it can, the first two, the scholar needs to be basically at the same era or at the same time, or be able to meet the sheikh or meet the narrator himself and test him to be able to give the verdict about the narrator. Now, the third one, which is the most common one, and can be done even years after the narrator has died, is the comparison of narrations. So imagine with me, we have the sheikh, and sheikh has got students, let's say 5 students. Now the sheikh will give the hadith in the form ABC. So you have 5 narrators, 5 students, each of them took the hadith ABC. Then those students will narrate the hadith to their students. Now, if 4 of those narrators give the hadith to their 5 or 6 or 7 narrators that they take the hadith from as ABC, and then one narrator comes and gives the hadith as DEF, then by comparing the narrations, we will be able to tell that this 5th person is not accurate with his narration, because we have 4 of the students narrated the hadith in the same way and he narrated differently. So this is what we call comparing the narrations. Now, this was their main way of identifying the accuracy of the narrator. So those were the main 3 ways that the scholars were able to test the accuracy of the narrators and come up with verdicts for each narrator. So inshallah, in the next lecture, this will be our first topic, is the terms that they used for the narrators and how does that apply later on to the hadiths being Saheeh, being Hasan, and being Da'if, inshallah. So to the next lecture, stay safe. Inshallah ta'ala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.